Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the distinguished chairman for yielding, and I rise in strong support of this legislation. I want to say to my friend who has just spoken, the ranking member of the committee who chaired the committee, who said they wanted to pay for things. What this bill does is puts statutory pay-go into law. He's right, after. But what he didn't say to you is when their side controlled the presidency, the House, and the Senate, they jettisoned paying for things. They did away with statutory pay-go. They did away with pay-go generally. And what happened? We went from substantial surpluses under the Clinton administration to substantial deficits under the Bush administration. Now, those substantial deficits and deficits that were created we were told would create great economic growth in our country. In point of fact, however, after 8 years of that economic policy where they jettisoned pay-go, a pay-go which provided $5.6 trillion of surplus available in March, according to President Bush, 2001. But they abandoned pay-go, which is in this bill. This is not a question of payoff to anybody. This was in the President's budget when he sat down here earlier in this year. It was in our budget that we passed the House and the Senate. We said we were going to do this. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. Today we have the chance to vote for health care our seniors can count on, and a fiscal future for all Americans, and that they can have faith in. Now, very frankly, my friend also said we on the Republican side want to fix this. My question is simply, why didn't you? Why do we still have this issue that confronts us year after year after year? Because we didn't have the courage to face it. I'm going to talk about the deficit because this adds to the deficit. I'll lament that, but there is not an option, as you added to the deficit every time you fixed it, 1 year at a time. And doctors couldn't rely on it, but more importantly, seniors couldn't rely on the fact that their doctors wouldn't have a big cut and push them out. I'm going to talk about that as well. We can do it by stopping a massive Medicare payment cut and by committing future policies to the tested principle of pay-as-you-go. Now, my friends on the other side of the aisle don't like pay-as-you-go because it constrained them in cutting revenues over $1 trillion, which is one of the reasons we have such a large deficit, because they didn't pay for what they bought. Friends, they bought at a rate twice the growth in spending that occurred during the 90s. In the 2000s, which was about 3.5% per year, it was 7% a year when my friends on the other side of the aisle controlled all of the levers of power. So they decreased revenue and increased spending, and we had large deficits. And the biggest recession we have faced since the 1930s were inherited by this administration and, frankly, by this Congress. Now, going back to the pay-as-you-go, first, the Medicare payment rate cut. If we do nothing, payments to doctors treating Medicare patients will drop by 21% in the new year, with more cuts in the years to come. If we allow that to take place, many seniors will find their doctor is no longer available to treat them. So this is not only about compensating doctors for the services that are vitally important and we want them to give, but it is also protecting seniors to access to doctors. That will mean less access to health care, longer waiting lists, and serious conditions going untreated. In some, if we do not act on this bill, it will mean sicker seniors. That's why it's essential that we stop these cuts before they're allowed to take effect. The cuts, of course, will occur on January 1st of this year, approximately 1 month from today. It is important to remember that this bill would simply prevent cuts, not increase payments to doctors. But it is true that ensuring our seniors access to their doctors will add to our deficit. just as extending any of the Bush tax cuts that are set to expire next year would do. Because seniors' health is at stake in this bill, I believe that stopping these payment cuts is worth the cost. It's also worth pointing out that this bill represents a new honesty in budgeting. As far as Democrats are concerned, the days of pretending that the cost of the doctor fix will be made up by even deeper cuts next year are over. And that, of course, is the policy we followed in the first 8 years of this decade. We pretended that somehow we'd fix it later, and we never did. Indeed, most of the costs associated with this bill are the result of stopping the gimmicks that were used for years and cleaning up the mess created by those gimmicks. The first step to getting out of debt is being honest about the debt we're in. It is too deep, it is dangerous, and we need to address it. So let's be honest, our country is in a deep fiscal hole for reasons that go far beyond Medicare payments. In fact, there's no one reason for our record national debt. And it's bipartisan in nature, not exclusively Republican in nature or Democratic. The causes include the previous administration's debt finance tax cuts, which I've spoken of, for America's essentially wealthier citizens who got most of the tax cuts. The cost of 2 wars, which we did not pay for, our escalating entitlement programs, which all of us have supported, the recession that we have confronted and that started in the last year of the 7th year of the previous administration's term, and the deficit spending we need to clean up that economic mess. Spending that economists tell us is necessary to stimulate demand in a recession. In other words, we needed to spend the money so to preclude a depression, not just a deep recession that we're in, and almost every economist, including Marty Feldstein, said that that was necessary. A recent New York Times analysis tells us that 90% of our deficit has been brought about by the policies of the previous administration and the extension of its policies and the economic crisis that it left behind. No one step will get us out of our fiscal hole. But the most important immediate step we can take is to commit ourselves to the principle that in new policies of our country, we will pay for what we buy. That is the principle of pay-as-you-go or pay-go, which was in place in the 1990s as we went from deep debt into surplus, and that $5.6 trillion surplus that President Bush inherited in 2001. In the 1990s, President Clinton used it to turn huge deficits into a record surplus, and when President Bush abandoned pay-go, and my friends on the other side of the aisle abandoned pay-go, record deficits returned. When Democrats took back the House majority in 2006, we demonstrated our commitment to fiscal responsibility by making pay-go a part of the House rules. It's sometimes been difficult. And now, with the support from President Obama and both chambers of Congress, we have a real chance to give pay-go the force of law by passing this bill. Under pay-go, Congress will be forced to offset all new policies, reducing revenues or expanding entitlements, so that they add nothing to our deficit. In essence, we will be forced to make the hard budgeting choices that are so tempting to avoid. We are avoiding them today. We ought to admit that very honestly. Why are we doing it? Because as a practical matter, in a deep recession that we're in, we cannot pay for it without depressing the economy further. That's not an acceptable alternative. If we want to cut taxes, we'll have to explain which programs will suffer cuts. If we want to expand entitlements, we'll have to spell out how we're going to pay for it. And no matter which party is in power, we'll be forced to distinguish wasteful spending and subsidies from the long-term priorities that really matter to our country. Some have complained that statutory pay-go would not apply to extensions of some existing policies that have bipartisan support, one of which is the one we're talking about today. Policies on the alternative minimum tax, which we've already done, and I, by the way, I'm one of those, wasn't in the majority, who voted against extending the alternative minimum tax if we did not pay for it. In addition to that, Medicare doctor payments, which we're talking about today, and the estate and middle income tax cuts passed in 2001 and 2003. I sympathize with their concerns they are not specious concerns. And I've said repeatedly that I would fight to pay for all of these policies. Hear me. If the Senate sends this back paid for, I will support it. I challenge all of you on that side of the aisle and all of you on this side of the aisle to do the same. That stands in contrast, frankly, to the first 8 years of this decade, when repeatedly it was stated that they do not believe that extensions of tax cuts need to be paid for. Unfortunately, it's a political reality that the votes to pay for extensions of the Bush policies are most likely not there. A pay-go law that ignored that fact would be waived for those policies, and then again and again, I prefer a law that we can enforce consistently. And very frankly, that is supported by some of the most consistent voters for fiscal responsibility on this floor. Mr. Speaker, in our country's economic meltdown last year, we all saw the damage that deep debt can do. It's time for us to learn that lesson and act on it. If we fail to act, liberal and conservative, Democratic and Republican, priorities will suffer alike. We can still prevent that outcome, ladies and gentlemen of this House. We cannot get back to fiscal health in one afternoon's vote. And we will not. And perhaps not in this president's term or the next. But we must start. We must take a step toward that end. This bill does that. Support not only ensuring our seniors access to quality medical services, but also ensure that we again adopt the policy that brought us $5.6 trillion in surplus, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas.
Parliamentary inquiry under
Gentleman
the
will stay